Sunshine fills my head, and dreams hang in the air. Gulls in the sky, and in my green eyes, you know it feels unfair. There's magic everywhere. Look at me standing here on my own again. I'm straight in the sunshine. No need to run and hide. It's so wonderful, wonderful life. No need to laugh and cry. It's so wonderful, wonderful life. The sun's in your eyes, heat is in your head. They seem to hate you because you're there. And I need a friend, oh I need a friend to make me happy. I stand here on my own. Look at me standing here on my own again. I'm straight in the sunshine. No need to run and hide. It's a wonderful, wonderful life. No need to laugh and cry. It's a wonderful, wonderful life. No need to run and hide. It's a wonderful, wonderful life. No need to laugh and cry. It's so wonderful, wonderful life.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for making the time to be here. We honour the life of a giant in our industry, Gerald Stone, storyteller, author, mentor, and an inspiration to many. For those who worked at 60 Minutes during the Gerald Stone years, he was our commander-in-chief. He gave us a sense of self, a belief that we can do something well and succeed. His talent was our gift, the gift of seeing our potential. So I say loudly, thank you, Gerald. And we pay our respects to Irene, his loving partner and source of strength for 45 years. They were some team together every step of the way. Now, Irene, I think, is the X factor in the Gerald Stone story. I can't think of a more fitting place to tell that story and recount our shared experiences than here in this studio. Gerald's career in journalism long preceded his time at Channel 9. But for the 60 Minutes family, this is where it all began. Let me take you back. The child of Russian Jewish immigrants, Gerald Lewis Stone was born on the 18th of August 1933, Columbus, Ohio. There were early signs of a fascination for journalism. A 6-year-old glued to the family radio, listening to Ed Murrow reporting World War II. He became a soldier in the Armed Forces of the United States, where his leadership qualities soon shone and promotion quickly followed. First Lieutenant Stone, 7th Field Artillery, Fort Steele, Oklahoma. Now, his promotion order reads in part, Dear Lieutenant Stone, Advancement comes to those who constantly strive to promote themselves and demonstrate their leadership ability. Your promotion is well deserved, and I wish you continued success. Signed, Brigadier General John F. Bird. Many years later, an old army mate of Gerald reminded him of the young men's battle cry, "Fire for and drop the core," a military euphemism for toughness under fire. Well, that's one interpretation. Another is that it applied mainly to drinking and dating. Whatever, both stood Gerald in good shape for the latter battles throughout his long career. He studied journalism at the Cornell University, graduating with distinction. 1957, his first job, copy boy with the New York Times. Now, around that period, at the height of the Cold War, Gerald made this observation. Rational Americans suffered a kind of temporary madness, contemplating the possibility of a planet erupting into multiple mushroom clouds, a full-scale nuclear war with a potential 50 million casualties, the toll predicted for a tit-for-tat with the Soviets. And so it was that in 1962, in the shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Stone family decided to go to somewhere safer, as far as possible from a nuclear fallout. Now, Australia at that time had opened its doors to migrants from Europe and the UK on the Assisted Migration Scheme, hence the term 10-pound POMs. Most applicants of sound health under 45 were eligible. That said, journalists were not top of the list. Armed with a clean police rap sheet, testimonials from his New York bosses, and promises of employment, Gerald argued his case. My 60 Minutes colleague and friend, Gareth Harvey here, came across a remarkable letter by Gerald. I'd like to share it with you. It was dated March 3, 1962, to the Australian Consulate General, New York City. I understand he pleaded that journalists as a category are not necessarily eligible for the assisted passage scheme. I can only hope that my education, special experience, and modest cash reserves of more than $1,000 would make me seem a worthwhile risk and an exception to the rule. Sincerely, Gerald L. Stone. Well, it worked. Gerald, his first wife Beth, and infant daughters Clay and Jennifer were granted assisted passage to the tune of £178, 11 shillings and threepence. As Gareth observed, not 10-pound POMs, but 40 quid Yanks with some change. So, on an outdated propeller-driven Canadian Pacific flight, the copy boy from Ohio made it to Sydney. No friends, relatives, or a job, and the population of Australia grew by 4 travel-weary migrants. The smart-ass customs officer on stamping their passports remarked, "Yank it is it? You're lucky to be here, mate." Gerald's first taste of the Aussie larrikin. He didn't have to wait long to get back to what he loved most, writing. Hired by the Daily Mirror on general rounds, he was soon to find himself in Vietnam. Now, in an interview, Gerald was asked, why do journalists like reporting wars? Well, he replied, it's usually the best story at the time. He reported with bravery and distinction. One of the first Western correspondents to question the morality and purpose of the Vietnam conflict and how it was being sold back home. But he never criticised or doubted the courage of the men sent to fight in Vietnam. He was recognised and decorated for his service as a war correspondent with the Vietnam Logistic and Support Medal and the Australian Active Service Medal. Now, television, us, were the beneficiaries of Gerald Stone, reporter on This Day Tonight and producer of several ABC documentaries. 1974, hired by Sir Frank Packer to head up Federal File. Now, the next step had its ups and downs. Gerald was appointed Network News Director, and it was not his crowning glory. News Centre 9 was a disaster. He thought it was all over, but it wasn't. It was just a blimp. August 1975, he finds himself reporting the invasion of East Timor, an assignment that had far-reaching personal consequences for Gerald. Some weeks later, he sent Cameron Brian Peters and reporter Malcolm Rennie back to Timor. two of the ill-fated Abo 5 murdered by Indonesian troops. I believe it was a decision that Gerald never put behind him. June 78, Kerry Packer calls him into his office for what Gerald describes as an internal examination without anaesthetic. He was given the most coveted job in the network, executive producer of Nine's new flagship program, 60 Minutes. As the author wrote of that moment, a grand lesson in how to make the human heart sink and soar all at once in 15 unforgettable words. I don't give a fuck what it takes, just do it and get it right, Kerry's edict. It was, of course, a two-edged sword. There was a healthy budget, but it came with conditions. As 60 Minutes struggled to find its feet, Kerry harangued his EP every step of the way. Editorial policy, story selections, even reporters' questions, and of course, the money. There could be no more difficult job in television than building 60 Minutes. Not only did the beast need feeding 42 weeks of the year, it needed protection. Gerald was our protector, keeping at bay an aggressive Kerry who would frequently give poor Gerald a terrible bollocking. It required toughness, an EP prepared to stand up to his proprietor. Kerry had found the right man. This Yank was as tough as nails. Steel ran through his veins. And when challenged, First Lieutenant Stone stood his ground. After its, what I call, a premiere flop on 11 February 1979, the gloves were off, attacks from the press, howls within the network to change the format. The stories were too long. Let's make it a kind of hybrid mix of showbiz, news, politics, cats up trees. To his credit, Kerry Packer would have none of that. The 60-minute format was not negotiable. But after the programme's poor start, Kerry hauled in his EP for what Gerald thought was a summary execution. A furious Kerry raged. He was going to cancel the show. "You've let me down, son. Now get out of my office." At that moment, I reckon, Gerald called on that regimental code, fire for and drop the core, that euphemism for toughness or dating and drinking. Well, he walked back into Kerry's office and said, "Look, Kerry, if you think I messed up, fire me or I will resign. But don't cancel the show. That would be absurd." Thank God for the US military. Sunday nights at 7:30 was Gerald's moment to relax over red wine with Irene as they watched the program, knowing that about an hour later, Kerry would be on the line, grumbling about a story he didn't like or rude questions that George Negus must have asked. "Have Leslie, Negus, Martin in my office in the morning," he demanded. Gerald replied, "You can't. They're somewhere in the world doing their job, and if you have a problem with my reporters, then let me handle it. That's what you pay me for." A reporter could not ask for a better boss. Gerald saw it as his duty of care to the program and to his people. For us, it was all a bit of black theatre, a war of words between two proud men, and that's all that it was. Gerald loved and admired his boss. He loved his passion, knowing that under Kerry's watch, 60 Minutes was safe. So we won the double, Gerald and Kerry. I spoke earlier about Timor and the legacy of Abo. My belief, shared by my colleagues, is that Gerald never really put it behind him. It haunted him. Reporting conflict, of course, was part of the job. We would find ourselves in many of the world's trouble spots. But never, not once, did Gerald pressure his people to accept high risks. To say no was an honourable thing. I'd covered many conflicts, including Beirut in '79, but I declined to go back there after the American hostage takings. I declined to go to El Salvador after a film crew was killed by government assassins. The way I figured it, against politically motivated squads or hit squads, getting out seriously diminished. That was cool with Gerald, and the other reporters made their own decisions. Now that said, while he was away in nasty places, Jan would often take a call from Gerald asking, how are you and how are the kids? Husbands, wives, families were an essential part of the 60 Minutes family. They mattered to Gerald. From a personal perspective, he was my boss, my mentor and friend. Now that's a rare combination. When I got the call from Gerald on that Friday night back in '78, it was like winning the lottery, then and for every one of 11 years that I shared with him. Gerald Stone enriched the lives of a generation of reporters, of producers and crews. This primetime warrior changed Australian current affairs. He owned Sunday night 7:30. In doing so, he shook up parochial and inward-looking Australian audiences to a world beyond their backyards. He brought the world into our lounge rooms. So what stood him apart? Unshakable ethics, a good sense of story, and the trust he showed to his people. The storyteller who left a blueprint for the way we tell our own stories to ourselves and others. That legacy continues to inspire. Just excuse me for a minute. Now, while respected and experienced journalists, the original reporting team were not household names. Ray Martin began working for the ABC as a cadet, rising through the ranks to the ABC's New York City correspondent. His ticking clock arrived by a long-distance call from Gerald. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ray Martin.
Thank you, Leza. Good afternoon, Irene. Lovely to see you. Hello to my old Channel 9 friends. I'm honoured to be with you today. Amazing how many people are still alive. Thought some of you had gone. Don't be sad. There's so much to celebrate. Gerald Lewis Stone was simply impeccable. You'll hopefully hear a range of adjectives today from speakers about Gerald. They'll end up saying the same thing, no matter what the adjectives. Probably some of the same stories. Gerald Stone was simply the best. What better place to pay tribute? I guess we'll all refer to this studio here today, but to pay tribute to Gerald, a fitting place. For the last rites, the last ritual, we're told, in the studio, at this old Willoughby Dream Factory, before the bulldozers tear it down. A big thanks to Hugh Marks and to Vic Buchan and to Kirsty Thompson for the celebration today, for organising it. In case you didn't know, it was just through those doors, just down that end, near the men's toilet and the props bay, that back in 1956, Bruce Gingell put a dinner suit on and said to Australia, welcome to television, just down there. Gerald would be chuffed, I think, Irene, for this send-off like this. He loved theatre and he loved a bit of history as well. We actually did the first 60 Minutes links here in this Studio 22 until we moved next door for the next 41 years. Gerald spent many long Thursday and Friday afternoons in the control room in there trying to get Negus in the early days to wear a different coloured corduroy jacket without the same soup stains, or to get Lezo to brighten up his tie, or maybe get me to change my wig. Yana, it seems, is always perfect, as she is. So this is the perfect place to say farewell to one of Australia's, as Lezo called him, TV's primetime warriors. One of Channel 9's favourite sons and most cherished sons. Again, just to quickly reiterate, Gerald first did award-winning documentaries here at 9. He was, ever so briefly, as Lisa said, the news director, infamously. And then Kerry Packer literally stole 60 Minutes from Channel 7. I had a lunch in late 77 with a boss at Channel 7, and he asked me to be a reporter on 60 Minutes at Channel 7 with Mike Willis at that stage. They didn't have a third reporter chosen. And then I got the call from, and then as I said, Kerry literally stole it from Channel 7 and instructed Gerald to make it the game changer on Australian television. Not just the #1 ratings program, which it quickly became, but a current affairs blockbuster that would change the rules. And that's what Gerald Stone did. He let nothing get in his way, not even Kerry Packer, as Lezo just described. Incidentally, knowing Gerald, I have to say, as we all did, I just can't imagine him ever allowing 60 Minutes to go to air any other time than 7:30 p.m. on a Sunday night. That was written in stone, excuse the pun. He'd have had us all processing in the canteen, I suspect, against any move to shift it from 7:30 on a Sunday night. Now, nobody could or would question Gerald Stone's immense talents as a journalist, his writing skills, his sense of a great story and how best to tell it. He was a touch tabloid, which was a good thing, and he was all class. He also had an uncanny ability, late on a Thursday night, to leave a dinner with Irene and friends and come into, I remember one particular, I was reminding Gary Albury today, into Gary Albury's editing suite. He'd come in and he'd look at the rough cut after a couple of nice bottles of wine. He'd say, yeah, that's a very nice story. But what about if you shifted the piece to camera from here to here and you switched that voice over to here? Would that make it better? He'd ask rhetorically. Of course it would, it always did. How did he do that? How did he do it time after time? We knew the story inside out and he'd walk in and say, would this be better? And it was. What extraordinary people skills he had as well. He was the sort of Wayne Bennett of television EPs, a unique ability to inspire people to perform way beyond their limits or what they thought were their limits. You never wanted to let Gerald Stone down if you're doing a story. Of course, Gerald also handpicked a near-perfect team of producers, not just the first bunch, but right through. Producers like Peter Meeken and Alan Hogan and the others. Camera crews like Nick Lee and Mickey Breen and Paul Bucock and others who are here today. Great editors like Gary and Dushin and Mick and Mick. Not just extraordinary talents, but temperaments to match the talents. People who simply had to get along and did get along, famously on the road. And they did without exception. How did you do that so impeccably? Then 2 years after we began, Gerald plucked this amazing but unknown young woman from Melbourne, Yarn Event. What a masterstroke that was. How did he do that? Mind you, there were also the occasional Force 9 gales, as my producer Andrew Horton used to call them. Now, you didn't want to be the target of one of Gerald's rages or anywhere near him when he let loose. Like when after a very long lunch, an unnamed reporter, first name Mike, second name Munro, punched a hole through the fibro wall in the reception cottage. Or when a producer, the late Gordon Bick, also after a long lunch, sent off some abusive emails to Rupert Murdoch because he'd just bought the Times of London. Or when Gerald asked me if I really wanted to be at 60 Minutes, after I said in a newspaper interview that viewers were ignorant if they got their opinions from 60 Minutes. Now, he calmed down a bit when I'd explained that I'd actually said if they got their opinions only from 60 Minutes without reading newspapers and magazines and books as well. You had to be very, very careful when you said publicly something about Gerald's baby, 60 Minutes. There was never any doubt, as Leslie said, the loss of news reporter Malcolm Rennie and cameraman Brian Peters and East Timor left an indelible scar on Gerald's heart whenever he subsequently sent people into danger, as he did. I remember one 60 Minutes trip, again with Andrew Horton, when we went into Northern Ireland, which was about as scary a place as I'd ever been, I think, at that stage, and Poland as the Russians were threatening an invasion, and then the week after that into Beirut when the American embassy was bombed. Gerald insisted on updates every night he could phone us, and we finally escaped on the last flight into Dubai before Lebanon closed the ports in the airport down for about 3 months. Gerald called Andrew to make sure that everyone was safe, and when we reassured him, Gerald said that Kerry had just phoned and demanded that we have a big silver service dinner on him. We knew it wasn't Kerry, it was Gerald, but we hung one on anyway. God knows what the bill was that night, as we could tell so many of those nights. The coffee, I think, was very, very expensive. You remember those golden days of television when budgets didn't really seem to matter? We went through those golden days. I began with the word impeccable to describe Gerald Stone. There were certainly rich, colourful times, the best of times, and the best of memories that we have. Leslie referred to his phone call. I remember mine, an early morning phone call about 3 a.m. in New York, was April 1978. My wife Diane and I were in New York almost 10 years into my stint as the ABC's North American correspondent. "Evening, Ray," Gerald said. Gerald Stone here. I knew Gerald in passing from my ABC connections. "Kerry Packer's just bought 60 Minutes, he told me. I'd like you to be one of my reporters. Are you ready to leave Auntie?" Let me think about it, Gerald. It was the best phone call I ever had. It changed my life forever and for the better. So we love you, Gerald. All right, I've got the job now. In the early years, George Negus was almost the face of 60 Minutes, I think, with his big moustache and his big personality. He was so recognisable he became George Fungus on the Paul Hogan shows, of course. George, by whatever name, lives up the North Coast these days. He sent this tribute to his great mate and colleague. Have a look.
To say the least, Gerald was a very special individual, not just an incredibly experienced media professional. His judgment for what we should and shouldn't do was impeccable. That said, he seemed willing to also accept our suggestions. Throughout this time, Gerald guided and encouraged us to do our own thing, our own way. For most of us, if not all of us, Gerald became a mentor. He never allowed us to get carried away with our own self-importance. When early in the piece, when 60 Minutes was accused of being an unmitigated dud, Gerald stuck by us, protected us from those early negative reactions, including one from Kerry Packer himself. 60 Minutes became essential viewing thanks to Gerald's leadership. It was, if you like, the TV Google of its time. Australians would remark, "Did you see 60s last night?" It was the go-to place for knowledge and explanation. Gerald twigged to the fact that until 60 Minutes Australia, most of this country's international coverage came almost exclusively from the US and the UK, not us here in Australia. After being mercilessly slagged, 60 Minutes, amazingly, quite quickly, emerged as fresh, compulsive, breakthrough television. On a highly personal note, Irene, and I hope you'll appreciate my reasons for saying this, but Gerald was more than my guide and mentor. I realised that for me, he was a father figure. I'm not sure if you guys realise that my own father died at 26 when I was only 4 years old. I never really had a father figure. I didn't really have a grandfather figure either. And so for the period I found myself working with Gerald, it was the closest I felt to being fathered. And I don't know where I'd be without him, keeping on encouraging me and believing in me like he believed so absolutely in all of us back in those early days. Even in the years that I've moved on from 60, whenever I found myself at a bit of a loss at how to approach a tricky project or a tricky person, or find the key to what I was actually trying to say, Gerald was always there, somewhere. There's a lot about Gerald Stone that nobody would know about. He was that kind of operator. It wasn't just a job. We were not just people who worked for him. There were people that he knew we had to go to hell and back on occasions to do what he wanted us to do. And there was always some way he made us feel better about that sort of thing. He was a very interesting human being, full stop, not just an amazing media person. To Gerald's wonderful and tolerant wife, Irene, thanks for lending us your Gerald. For that matter, lending Gerald to the people of Australia.
Thank you, George. Beautifully told, and thank you, Ray. Now, as Ray said earlier, in 1982, Gerald played his ace card. He lured her from behind a news desk in Melbourne to be the first female reporter on his team. In doing so, he created an icon. Her work on 60 Minutes inspiring women to take up a career in broadcasting. Of course, I'm talking about Jana.
It is so wonderful to be here in this particular studio to honour Gerald and his wonderful life. He was a very interesting human being, full stop, as my lovely colleague George just said, and right he is. My colleagues have spoken about Gerald through their eyes as our boss. I'll try to give you something a little bit from my perspective. Gerald took a very, very big chance on me in the early 80s. Neither of us, I think, had any idea of how or even whether the experiment of hiring a new reporter for this already famous show of his would play out. He was crazy brave enough to gamble on a largely unknown, let's face it, girl, and I was naive enough to think that I was up to the task. One of my early memories of Gerald is the momentous limo drive on a dazzling Sydney sunny day as Gerald accompanied me to Kerry Packer's mansion. We were headed there to seek Mr. Packer's approval for Gerald's choice. And although I'm absolutely sure Gerald would have been on edge, he did not show it. His demeanour was even and composed, and his beautiful dark eyes were alert. I, on the other hand, his 24-year-old charge, was overwhelmed, knees knocking like a country cousin on a first visit to the big city, in this case to the hub of Australian network television. Gerald's heart may also have been pounding, I expect, but he made it all seem routine. He looked after me, just as he would on many, many other occasions. I must say, I do recall one instance, though, when he did let slip that he was a little bit anxious. It was a few months ahead of my scheduled debut on 60 Minutes. There was by then absolutely no escaping the fact that the seasoned team of Negus, Leslie and Martin would be joined by someone who was, well, to put it kindly, junior. Gerald said, please tell me you will have turned 25 by the time we put you to bed. To this day, Gerald, I have to say, is the only person ever to ask me to hurry up and get older, and that at least I have managed, Gerald. To my eyes, back then, I have a different perspective, I think, from my colleagues, because the circumstances were as I've just described them. To my eyes back then, he was a powerhouse, a person with this awesome instinctive nous and fabled journalistic experience. At times, as time wore on, as I got used to working in the 60 Minutes office, as dramas of one sort or another arose, it felt sometimes as though the world was on fire. In these moments, it was a pleasure to watch Gerald. He was in command, he made the critical calls, and he righted the ship with what I would call imperial style. His editorial judgment was based on what seemed to me to be a close to unerring feel for how stories should be told and made appealing to the widest possible audience. He had an intuitive sense which rarely let him down. Consequently, when you went on the road, it was Gerald, not all the other wonderful people who put the show together and were responsible for its success, but it was Gerald you really set out to impress. It was his imprimatur that you desperately sought. You really wanted Gerald, in a way, to bless your efforts. As you've heard from my colleagues, he could also be a fearsome creature. A phone call from Gerald while you were away from home base was not always the most desirable turn of events, to put it mildly. A personal call often meant that the boss was sufficiently motivated to locate you, perhaps thousands of kilometres away, in order to pass on the full range of your manifest failings to you. And as I think Ian mentioned, you were not, and so did Ray, you were not safe in the office with Gerald, either face-to-face, due to the possibility of this remarkable force of nature, called in fact the Force 9, which became legendary in the annals of the show. The way I experienced it, it was at first inaudible to the human ear. It was a rage that incubated somewhere low and deep inside the boss. Its first detectable sign was a violent trembling of the lip, after which the thing surfaced like a volcanic eruption, and it was indeed heard far and wide across the suburban cottages, just down the way from here, that housed 60 Minutes. I have to say I did test the system a good few times, but thought I genuinely qualified for the Force 9 treatment at least on one occasion. I do remember coming back from the United States after interviewing Noam Chomsky, the fierce political activist, social critic, and much trumpeted academic linguist. I remember being quite pleased with myself, delivering to Gerald what I thought was a spirited exchange with a high-powered, internationally renowned figure. It was most unfortunate that Gerald saw it differently. He said the interview was unwatchable. Apparently so combative that no 60 Minutes viewer could or would ever be subjected to it. Now, I can honestly say, and I think I'll be believed in this room, that it wasn't and probably isn't often that 60 Minutes rejects anything at all on the basis of being too combative. So I'll leave you to imagine the atmospherics of that interview. And by the way, I'm not sure why I was spared the Force 9 on that day, but I was, and I'm still grateful to Gerald for that. When I think now, on this occasion of Gerald in those years, I remember the wonderful American accent delivered in the mellifluous voice, the striking looks that hinted at Gerald's Russian ancestry and, of course, his Jewish roots, the pugnacious spirit, the charm, the 1,000-watt smile, the sophisticated conviviality on display at social occasions. And although our boss-to-employee relationship ended in 1986, it was my great good fortune to reconnect with Gerald and his marvellous Irene in the 90s after their return from New York. What developed between us over many, many meals with my husband and Gerald and Irene turned into a lasting and deep friendship. The Gerald I came to know through this period was a busy writer, a person who was, of course, still intensely interested in the world, who'd retained his journalistic eye, applying it to politics and media, among many other subjects, a person who was in his element, in company, still with that 1,000-watt smile, a man given to analysing human behaviour. I would say the human psyche was a specialty, the female psyche a particular specialty, a man whose looks defied his age, and a self-deprecating man bemused at being granted such a long life. He was also a husband who was abidingly proud of Irene and all her stellar achievements. It is, I think, a testament to the regard in which Gerald is held in his field that many of the executive producers who followed him at 60 Minutes chose to seek out his advice. I know he was always ready to offer his counsel, to be generous with what he'd learned, and to be objective when asked to weigh in on a contentious issue. As my dear colleagues have said, Gerald's contribution to public affairs broadcasting is indeed enormous. From a very personal perspective, though, the strongest sense I retain of Gerald now springs from the time after we worked together through our friendship over the last more than 20, can it really be that long, more than 20 years. Most of all, I remember now, and I think forever, Gerald's kindness and his love. I, and we, I think, were very lucky indeed to have known him.
Thank you, Jana. Now, I spoke a little earlier about the hard time that Kerry used to give Gerald over a number of things. After Jana joined us, we were equally as tough on our EP. I think George, Ray and I, we traipsed one by one into Gerald's office and said, "Why are you putting on this beginner? We've been out there bashing around the world. We've got the runs on the board. and you're putting someone so inexperienced. So we were pretty puffed up. But boy, did she show us where we were wrong. She was the fastest learner I've ever known, and she fitted in very, very quickly. Well done, Jana. Now, Alan Hogan is an investigative journalist, founding reporter of ABC Radio AM. He filed for This Day Tonight and for Four Corners. I can proudly say he was my first producer on the show. He is here to speak for those talented people who got little of the accolades, those behind the camera and in editing suites. Please welcome, wherever you are, Alan. Come up here and talk to us. Alan Hogan.
Thanks, Ian, very much. It's a great honour to be asked to speak here today, and our thoughts are with you today, Irene. When Gerald offered me a job on a new program he was starting at Channel 9 back in 1978, I was somewhat apprehensive. At that time, I'd been working for the ABC for about 12 years, and although I had great respect for Gerald, I wasn't sure that leaving the safe bosom of the ABC for the uncertainties of commercial television would be the wisest career move. It was round about then that Ray Martin phoned me from New York to say that Gerald had also offered him a job on the new program. And like me, he wondered whether it might be a good career move. We both agreed that Gerald was an excellent journalist, having admired the work that he'd done on This Day Tonight. And when we heard that some of our other ABC colleagues had accepted Gerald's offer, we reckoned that the cultural shift to commercial television might not be all that worrying. Until then, I'd worked as a reporter, but Gerald wasn't offering me a job as a reporter. He wanted me to be a producer. And at that time, I wasn't quite sure what that meant. I'd been used to researching, planning, lining up the interviews, and making the travel arrangements for all the stories that I reported. And in Australian TV current affairs at that time, the notion of a field producer was virtually unknown. But Gerald envisaged a format where there would be only 3 reporters on the program. At one stage, there were going to be 4 reporters, one of them female, but that's a story for another day. The only way 3 reporters could each produce a major story every week was if they had a great deal of assistance with the legwork. That was the job of the producer, or should I say producers, because while one producer was on location with Ian or Ray or George, another producer would be lining up their next story or supervising the editing of their last story. It's a tribute to Gerald's organisational skills that this plan worked brilliantly. There's no doubt that with so many competitive big egos to deal with, there was the risk of and the reality of creative disagreements, to put it mildly. But somehow bonds and allegiances were forged, and I found that the producer-reporter relationship allowed me to be part of creating some great journalism without the mixed blessing of being recognised in every supermarket I went into. Gerald had the ability to attract some extremely skilled producers to work for him in those early years, and I think this might be the appropriate place to mention some of them by name. I hope I don't miss anyone important here, I'm sure I will, but my memory of those days goes back to some outstandingly good people I worked with. Peter Meeken, Andrew Horton, Anthony McClellan, Warren McStoker, John Little, John Penlington, and Stuart Goodman, to name just a very few of those early pioneers. And there was a young chap called Gareth Harvey running around the colleges at that stage who showed some promise. And it wasn't just the producers who were the unseen faces of 60 Minutes. There were the researchers, camera crews, film editors, technical producers, and unit managers, all of whom were vital to the success of the program. Again, Gerald hired some of the best in the business. Cameramen like Nick Lee, Phil Donahue, Vern Moore, Brendan Ward, and sound recordists like Mickey Breen, Skeet Kelly, Ben Crane and David Norton Smith, and editors like Adrian Hobbs, Gary Albury and Dushan Werner, and later they were joined by Mike Shergwin, Tom Picorni and Alison Black. Nor should I forget Ray Blair, whose job it was to sync up the rushes in the days when people knew what that meant. And I certainly couldn't overlook the wonderful contribution of Jeff Cameron, who always miraculously found a way to approve our sometimes outrageous expense accounts. I know I'm showing my age when I recall time spent in editing rooms where our precious stories existed in strips of tiny 16mm film with their matching soundtrack hung up on pegs in bins. And it was the editor's task to literally stick these bits together and make a coherent story out of them, all the while handling the original film so that it wouldn't get dirty or scratched or damaged, and ensuring that the soundtrack stayed in sync with the image. And then they had to undo it all and rearrange it when Gerald cast his expert eye over the first cut and worked his magic to turn it into something better. More recently, when I've been in editing rooms, I've learned to refrain from saying to the editor, "You have no idea what it was like before digital editing." It's a matter of record, as has been said here today, that 60 Minutes was not an instant success. In his book, John Little tells the story of the phone call to Gerald from Kerry Packer after the first night saying, "You've blown it, son." It must have been an agonising time for Gerald. The ratings were in single digits and no executive wanted to be associated with this catastrophe. But in the programme's fourth week, George Negus told a story about a disease that was killing children in the slums of Naples. And in his angry stand-up, probably with the coat slung over his shoulder, he criticised the authorities, and the legend of the Balmain cowboy was born, and the program never looked back. It's true that Gerald inherited the format for 60 Minutes from the American CBS program, but that format was no guarantee of success. What Gerald understood was that the cardinal sin of journalism was to be boring. But that didn't mean you couldn't tackle serious subjects. And he certainly believed that parochialism wasn't a virtue. In those early years, Ian Leslie won a Walkley Award for his story on the Thai drug laws. He interviewed the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, and reported on the devastating aftermath of Idi Amin's despotic rule in Uganda. A story he did with a Sydney woman who had killed her violent husband after years of physical abuse and violent abuse led to a change in the law where the notion of justifiable homicide was first introduced. George and I travelled to El Salvador to report on the horrific violence inflicted on opponents of the right-wing government there. And back home, we went to Maralinga in Central Australia to tell the story of the devastating effects the atomic tests there had had on Australian servicemen. Gerald believed these stories were the core of good journalism, and he supported and encouraged us to tell them. At the risk of sounding like an old has-been, those were the days. Finally, I have to say, as others have said, that Gerald was a great boss. A cliche, firm but fair, might have been coined for him. He had a notoriously bad temper if crossed. In fact, on one occasion, which I won't go into, he fired me. I turned up for work the next day, made my apologies, and we proceeded to say it had never happened. Then there was the time he thought it would be nice if I took my wife, Jess, on one of our assignments and get to know what it was like to travel business class and stay in a 5-star hotel. That was Gerald's way of a pat on the back for a good year's work. We ended up in the Cipriani Hotel in Venice, so exclusive that our arrival with 20 boxes of camera gear was greeted with utter disdain by the hotel staff, who treated us as though we were the tradesmen coming to fix the plumbing. Gerald, thanks for the gig. It changed my life fundamentally. I feel enormously privileged that you gave me the opportunity to be part of the golden years of television journalism. Your legacy will not be forgotten.
Thank you, Alan. In all our years working together, about 3 or 4, this is the first time I found out that Gerald actually fired you. Thank goodness he put you back on the team. Our next speaker, Stan Grant, is a Gerald Stone protege. He gave him his start as host of Seven's Real Life, and that was the beginning of an exceptional career. Stan joins us now in this tribute to his mentor. Stan Grant.
Thank you, Ian. Irene, thank you so much for inviting me here today. You know how much Gerald meant to me. We've heard a lot about Gerald today. Gerald, of course, the journalist, the soldier, the boss. But I want to talk about Gerald, the freedom rider, because Gerald was a freedom rider. In 1965, as a journalist working for the Daily Mirror, he got on a bus with a group of Sydney University students led by the Aboriginal activist Charles Perkins. They were on their way to smash down segregation in outback New South Wales, where Aboriginal people were denied entry to the pubs, the hotels and the swimming pools, where people who were the first people of this country lived as refugees in their own country. This was the world that I was born into, the life that I had as a boy, and Gerald was putting it on the front pages of Australia's newspapers. Later, he travelled to Bowraville in northern New South Wales for this day tonight. Bowraville at that time, in the 1960s, had posters of the Ku Klux Klan in the local pub halls. It was a place, again, where Aboriginal people could not enter the cinema, and on the nights when they were allowed to enter, had to enter through a side door after everyone else had taken their seats. And Gerald, in that remarkable, polite, disarming, charming way, asked questions of the locals that revealed a place that was not so much different to the deep south of America that he had seen and grown up in while in the United States. If you go forward 30 years from then, Gerald arrives at Channel 7 to set up Real Life and looks around at Australia again and sees an Australia that needs to change and an Australia that needs challenging. And he took a chance on a very young, green and frankly not very good journalist at that stage of my career and made me the host of Real Life. I remember having lunch with Gerald and he said to me, at that point he was considering putting me on the show, and he said, "Do you have any Uncle Louis in your family?" By Uncle Louis, he meant any unsavoury characters. I said, "Gerald, have we met?" There are not many more other than Uncle Louis in my family. But I remember him saying to me that putting me on Real Life, taking that punt with me, convincing the Channel 7 management and the board that I was worth taking a punt on, he said to me that the fact he was doing it with me made it all the more worthwhile. Now, Real Life is not the high watermark of my own career, and it was far from the high watermark of Gerald's, but it left behind, I think, a very deep legacy. Because Australian television did change. If you turn on our television screens today and you watch The Project on Channel 10 and you see Waleed Ali, or you turn on the Today Show on Channel 9 and you see Brooke Boney, or you watch people like Jeremy Fernandez at the ABC, what Gerald saw then that needed to change is slowly changing. You know, there is a word in my culture, a phrase in my culture, Yinjamara Winangana, and it means to live with respect in a world worth living in. And I think there is no doubt that Gerald, through his work and his life and the people that he touched, created a world worth living in. And throughout my career, as I've gone on, I've tried to honour that trust and faith that he put in me, travelling around the world and having the opportunities that I've had, knowing that I would not have had those opportunities were it not for a man named Gerald Stone, and to have honoured that respect by making my work count. Yinjamara Winangana, to live in a world worth living in. Gerald told me a story once about one of the infamous telephone calls that he took from Kerry Packer, and you've heard some of them here today. And he said that Kerry was screaming down the phone at him. And Gerald interrupted to say, "Kerry, I've got 1 million viewers and you're just one of them." Kerry said, "Well, I think I would count for at least 2. Well, Gerald certainly counted for 2. Gerald, from me to you, Yinjamara, Bumuduani, Mandangur. Respect, old warrior. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Beautifully spoken. Now, Alan reminded me, and I think we, at some stage, even if we didn't know it, nearly all got fired on 60 Minutes. I once said the stupid thing in an interview with New Idea that I think Channel 9 was wrong in paying Lindy Chamberlain $250,000. I think it was split between the Women's Weekly and Channel 9 because I didn't like checkbook journalism. Well, all hell broke loose, not from Gerald so much. Sam Chisholm came down on me like a ton of bricks, called me lower than a snake's belly, that I had let down my colleagues, that I was a traitor, and that he didn't know what to do with me. Anyway, I went into Gerald and I said, is this the end? He said, "Well, I think you can be thankful that Kerry doesn't read. He watches too much television." Years later, I had Gerald at a conference and I said, "Were you going to fire me that time?" And he said, "No, I had your back." So there you are, he was our protector. Now, the Gerald Stone story would not be complete without recognising Peter Meeken. He is with us here today. Peter was a massive factor behind our success in those early years and in the post-Gerald era. Part of the fabric at 60, his contribution cannot be overstated. An astute judge of stories, motivator, and a creative force. The Meeken humour, of course, is the subject of many 60-minute moments, some at Gerald's expense. My colleague Ray mentioned one of those a few weeks back, and I'd like to share it with you. On losing a fierce argument, there was much shouting with his EP over a story idea. Meeken had lost, and he retorted, "Anyway, what would you know, Gerald? You're the guy who said Jesus Christ wasn't a good story." That could only come from Peter Meeken. On behalf of all who worked with the program, then and now, thank you, Peter. The final word comes from someone who understands the pressures of primetime current affairs. So on behalf of the Nine Network, would you please welcome Kirsty Thompson, Executive Producer, 60 Minutes. Kirsty.
On behalf of 9 and 60 Minutes, I'd like to thank all of you for coming to celebrate the remarkable life of Gerald Stone. And for those of you watching on 9 Now, thank you for tuning in. As we've heard so eloquently today, Gerald is one of the most significant people in the history of Australian television. A pioneer of news and current affairs, one whose contribution cannot be overstated. It's a strange feeling to be standing here right now because as 9 is currently moving to its brand new office tower in North Sydney, the iconic 60 Minutes cottages next to us, just over there, are being bulldozed as I speak. And this is one of the last times this studio will ever be used. But oh, how it was used when Gerald was in charge. Close your eyes and imagine 4 decades ago, Gerald wandering through here, making sure Ray, George, Ian and Yana knew who they were. You can still hear the echo. I'm Ray Martin. I'm George Negus. I'm Ian Leslie. I'm Jana Vent. Those stories and more tonight on 60 Minutes. But of course, in the beginning, as we've heard, there was also another I'm Gerald had to contend with. I'm Kerry Packer thundered into Gerald's ears more than he wanted. And it's a story that's been told a million times, the clear order Mr. Packer gave Gerald when he put him in charge of 60 Minutes. Just do it and get it right. Boy, did Gerald get it right. Under extraordinary pressure, he assembled one of the finest current affairs reporting and production teams in Australian television history. With them, and armed with his own incredible work ethic and uncanny understanding of the Australian audience, Gerald made 60 Minutes the biggest hit on TV. It was a remarkable balancing act, a serious current affairs program that dared to entertain, a perfect example of must-watch television imbued with Gerald's style and purpose, as well as a clear-eyed vision that to this day continues to set the gold standard for those of us lucky enough to follow in his footsteps. I first met Gerald during what one might charitably call a difficult time for the program, the Beirut misadventure. This was certainly not the way I ever dreamt of locking eyes with such a giant of journalism and the father of the program I was now in charge of, but there was no avoiding it. Gerald was the obvious choice to head up an inquiry into what went wrong. At the time, I knew just how much the program meant to him, even though it had been 20 years since he left, and I also knew about his legendary temper. So I guessed he wasn't going to be too pleased to see me. But do you know what? An extraordinary thing happened. We became friends. Of course, that's not to say that during that terrible time, Gerald held back any of his opinions. He was tough. But he was also incredibly generous with his advice. It was very obvious he cared. I will never forget his compassion during that time and that of his wonderful wife, Irene, and I will be forever grateful for their guidance. 2 years later, I was lucky enough to work with Gerald on a much happier project. To mark 40 years on air, we were told 60 Minutes was going to be inducted into the Logies Hall of Fame. As we set about putting together the segment of highlights that would run during the Logies telecast, we instinctively pulled a trick straight out of the Gerald Stone playbook, as we often did and still do. We made him the Noah in the story of 60 Minutes. It goes without saying he was perfect for the job. Gerald received a standing ovation when the award was announced. He then delivered a television producer's dream, a 60 Minutes moment, when he chastised himself for crying as he held up the gold statue. That event was not only a celebration of the program, it became, fittingly, a celebration of the trailblazer who started it all. It was also recognition that after 4 decades of 60 Minutes, Gerald's vision and ethos was still going strong. It is the heart and soul of every single story that goes to air today. His shadow continues to loom large over everything we do. Like many of you here today, I am a signed-up, card-carrying member for life of the What Would Gerald Do Club. He was and is an inspiration to me, and not just me, but to everybody at the program. What a man and what a life. Thank you, Gerald.
Everybody's talking at me. I don't hear words they're saying, only the echoes of my mind.
You don't get to where you're at and achieve at any level without putting yourself under pressure.
Welcome, executive producer Gerald Stone. Here, say hello.
Let's meet the godfather of Australian news and current affairs.
Well, Johnny, I think that we're seeing history made tonight. It may be the start of a new secondary industry. Every homeowner can be his own snail grazier.
Well, why not?
What's the quickest way to get in a fight in an Australian pub?
Just turn around and drink your beer.
Now the middy or schooner, whatever you're drinking, turn your glass upside down, and that's it. You challenge everyone in the bar.
Well, there's only one thing to do with a scientific hypothesis, and that's prove it. I think I'm a little skeptical of this business of hands up on the bar causing a fight, and that's what I'm going to do is check it. You see, I told you I didn't think I can get in a fight this way in a Sydney bar.
There's no doubt I've had an amazing career given that I'm an American migrant who came here in 1962. I never had any television experience, so it was amazing that I was accepted as an ABC reporter on the stage at night.
It seems these days we're always hearing about some yacht leaving Sydney Harbor on an exotic South Sea cruise with an all-woman crew. Well, it's refreshing to have an all-man crew with an all-woman skipper. Avast up there, skipper. Can you come down here and see us a second? Good, thanks. This is Gerald Stone reporting to you from the top of Australia's highest building, Australia Square in downtown Sydney. Why would anybody want to steal a bulldozer? Probably to clear their own property or work in a quarry where they can earn fairly big money with it. How much is a tractor like this worth? Approximately $10,000.
Could you at least tell us whether you're happy at the terms of the telegram?
Yes, yes.
And this is a new development, sir. You're deciding. Mr. Whitlam, if you could just speak.
It's very hard for anyone to maintain a middle position.
Nor should they. I don't think so. I find it difficult to understand how anyone can remain in the middle.
It's quite a new development. I'm considering.
One other thing, sir. When will you make a comment on this?
Yeah, sure. And I just got a glass of wine right in the middle of my eye. Splashed up and it hit me right in the eye.
Hello, Jerry. What's it like up there in the clouds? Do you need any oxygen? Hello, Gordon. How are things down there? We may not be as big as you, but we're certainly practical. What's that you say? I can't hear you!
If one of your 60 Minutes reporters came to you today with a story in which they'd shouted from the top of buildings, what would you do?
I'm not prepared to answer that. When I first got to Vietnam in '65, it was the first war that seemed to unfold in the living room, that you saw bodies and blood. But it really, what the people were seeing was a sanitized version. Nobody ever really saw guts hanging out of a man or his brain hanging out.
There must be some kind of way out of here.
I think in Vietnam, you've got this perspective of we're all in it together, that the Americans and the Viet Cong were suffering together. And so you have reporters talking about human beings, not about Americans or Viet Congs, but about the human condition. And I think that's one step up the ladder of reporting. We had to destroy the town in order to save it. An old quote from the Vietnam War with new meaning for Cambodia.
Can you explain why journalists, cameramen go into a war zone?
Usually because it's the best story around. And most journalists want to cover the best story that's around.
Well, the problem, it seems, has quite a simple solution. Where you meet resistance, you have to oppose it. The only difference is that Snool was in Cambodia, not in South Vietnam.
It seems strange, maybe even a little hateful, to talk about war as fun, but there was just no doubt that it was fun.
We're just running. Shooting has broken out in the village across the street. Just get down behind the barrels. It's hard to tell where the fire came from.
That's rifle fire, repeated rifle fire, before we heard mortar going off.
Suddenly you find yourself in a situation where you're out marching with men, knee-deep in mud, possibly going hungry or not having water, people shooting at you, and you're feeling this this, I hate to say it, but a mako, a sense of sharing, a very masculine thing, men confronting their own selves. That's what danger is. And of course, as a journalist, then you were able to leave that situation. You were able to take your story back, know that you've got a good story, come back to your hotel, have a nice wash or shave, have a beautiful dinner, a lot of drinks, and talk about what was happening and what you were going to do tomorrow. Now, that was really exciting stuff, and I think that any journalist, if he was prepared to look at himself, would admit that it's probably one of the most exciting times of his life to be in a war.
It was over in less than 30 minutes from the time the missionaries were ordered out of their rooms and offices to the bursts of rifle and machine gun fire.
It's hard to know where to begin a report like this, and I think it has to begin in the hospital, where it's the end product of a war that's raged unabated for 3 weeks.
You were news director at the time when the journalists were sent to Timor.
Yes.
And as a result, several of them were killed.
Well, 2 of my journalists.
Mm. How did you feel about that? How do you live with that responsibility?
Well, it's a terrible thing to live with, that you realize that 2 young guys that were alive before you sent them on assignment are suddenly dead. And I don't think I'll ever really erase that thought from my mind. And yet there's no doubt in my mind that both those fellows wanted to go, as many fellows in our newsroom did, because it was a good story. We looked at the risks, we talked about it. The cameraman who went and was subsequently killed had been with me, and we thought it was a risk worth taking.
Idi Amin, feeling that the revolution is over, that his power is consolidated, says that he's ready to show Uganda and the world a new face. And who knows, maybe he will. Parties and celebrations won't solve Uganda's problems, but they're not a bad way to start. This is Election 75. I'm Gerald Stone. You're aware of the criticism, and some of it directed specifically at you because of your commercial background, that this inquiry is going to be nothing more than a whitewash for commercial interest. Now, what do you say to that type of comment?
Well, every profession has its tremendous moral problems. A priest who hears the confession of somebody who's committed murder, a lawyer who has to defend somebody he thinks is guilty. With a journalist, you believe that what you're doing in the long run is going to be good for your society, even though it has some short-term problems. And one of those short-term problems is seeming to be cruel or uncaring.
I'm Ian Leslie.
I'm George Negus.
I'm Ray Martin. Those stories and more tonight on 60 Minutes.
60 Minutes started in a great deal of controversy. We were rubbished in the newspapers. People said we'd never, be the shortest-lived public affairs program in the history of Australian television.
I got a call at home. With the American accent on the other end of the phone, it was Gerald Stone, the EP. He said, Ian, he said, we're working on a program called 60 Minutes. And he said, I'd like you to join us. Would you like to do that? And I said, when can I start?
How would you execute that man?
Whiskey demand like this.
Just cut there, mate.
The Mujahideen will never accept defeat.
What I'm doing is pointless, possibly even wrong.
Gerald, was it deliberate that you kept sending Ian to war zones and refugee camps and all those hard stories?
Just because I saw his first expense accounts in Berlin Museum, and I decided to keep him in the jungles.
This morning from our base in Algeria.
I did one story, I remember, and Gerald said, what's it called? I said, if the world had ends, this place will be one of them. He didn't ask me where it was. He said, go and do it.
Of course, there's the all-important passport.
Turn
that
thing off.
Afghanistan was the first country in the world to recognize the Soviet regime.
60 Minutes is one of those once-in-a-lifetime opportunities.
This little pup's just about 5 days old, and he's terrified.
What makes Haiti different is voodoo.
It was not only great to launch a program like that, but to see the impact that it had on almost every element of Australian life.
Did you kill Azaria?
No, why?
Speaking of the impact of 60 Minutes is such that we did a story on her piece a few weeks ago, and we were told that the day after it cut the prostitution trade in Darlinghurst by 50%.
Now that's impact, I'll say.
Yes,
right.
Of of course, on Sunday night, I would watch the program, relax, have a few drinks. And there was one night when I had a few too many drinks, and Carrie had a few too many opinions. But all of a sudden, I really lost it as a, not a journalist, a brave journalist or something, but just as a drunken old person trying to relax. And I said, look, Carrie, I've got 3 million viewers, and you're only one of them. And there was this long pause, and then he came back and said, I would have thought I'd at least count for 2.
I think Gerald Stone will go down in Australian commercial broadcast history as the finest EP ever. He's just an enormous intellect, but he's a passionate and a humane person. He was a wonderful boss. He was a hard taskmaster. When Gerald got mad, he didn't turn red and scream and rant and rave. His lip would tremble, and you knew you were in trouble.
Do you ever fight with them? Because
yes, we do fight. I mean, 60 Minutes does fight. There's no doubt about it.
I remember this with Gerald sitting in the edit suite when you've put together the story that is not quite the story that you had promised, Gerald, and just there I remember there was this sort of, there was a silence. And I know it's a contradiction in terms, but it was like a thudding silence. And then you knew that something was going to come but wasn't going to be good from Gerald's mouth. So then, depending on his frame of mind at any given point, it would either be a very quiet observation that the story didn't quite make it, or quite a noisy one.
60 Minutes. Accepted by Gerald Stone, a man who can talk underwater with a mouthful of marbles.
The ABC may pretend otherwise, but it really is a great honor to be called up here in front of the people you most respect in an industry you devote your life to, and have this little fellow whispering in your ear, well done.
Gerald was the best boss I ever had in my 50-year career. He used to say with storytelling, for example, that imagine you're telling mates at a barbecue, or imagine you're telling your family at dinner, just where you've been. So it was all about storytelling and about pictures.
You did have a sense that if you made a story for Gerald, it would be the best possible story for the country. Oh, he'd love that, wouldn't he? Love me saying that. But you know, there is truth in that he got the proportions and the mechanics of the story almost always right. So you know, you did aspire to that.
Welcome to real life. It could be the greatest shame of all.
3 years ago, nobody ever heard of Stan Grant. Now, for better or worse, everybody has heard of him, and I think he'll go on to do great things. When all is said and done, if I look at my contribution, it won't be measured in programs, but it'll be on the people you meet and try to nurture and hopefully give them a boost up.
What's your favourite news and current affairs program on Australian TV now?
God, I would never answer that, Tracy.
Welcome to the TV Week Logies Hall of Fame, 60 Minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. Good reporters don't cry. So I guess I lost my chance to be a good reporter.
I chose Irene and she chose the rest.
I think this, even though it's a very new garden, will age very nicely. You know, it'll mellow as it gets older. You know,
tempted to ask questions about your spouse when you say things like that.
My mellow old spouse.
Yeah, well,
some would say he's mellow and some would say he's not.
I'm going where the sun keeps shining through the pouring rain.
I happened to arrive in Australia at a very lucky time. I'm an Australian citizen. I love the country, and I think the best thing I ever did was move to Australia. But I can't believe the success that I've enjoyed, and people still come up to me on the street sometimes and say, "Didn't you used to be Gerald Stone?" I say, "Yes, I used to be."
I